Auchinvole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change Issues and asks, what report has he received on support for emissions trading schemes as an effective measure to reduce climate change?
Honourable Dr.
Mr. Speaker, emissions trading schemes are widely accepted as the most efficient way of reducing emissions, with schemes now operating in 29 of the 38 Kyoto developed countries. As well, there are many states in the US, in Canada and in parts of Asia that have also adopted such schemes.
Chris Auchinvole.
Supplementary to the Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Minister received any reports of parties reversing their position on an emission trading scheme?
Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, yes I have. Radio New Zealand reported yesterday that Labor is reconsidering its climate change policy and whether it would have a carbon tax instead of an ETS. I note that such policy U-turns has not been particularly helpful across the Tasman.
Chris Auchinvole.
Supplementary to that. Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. What would the impact of switching from an emissions trading scheme to a carbon tax be?
Honourable Dr.
Speaker,
Smith.
Mr. Speaker, such a switch would be hugely destabilising. New Zealand has struggled for over a decade to develop a credible and consistent policy on climate change that puts a price on carbon emissions and has switched already twice between the options of a carbon tax and an emissions trading scheme. My greatest worry is in the forestry sector, which Labor introduced into the ETS in 2008 under a scheme that requires stability over the harvest cycle of trees. It's hugely damaging to now contemplate scrapping that scheme that would potentially risk deforestation and a lack of confidence in that sector. I also note that it would be bad news for consumers in that the previous carbon tax policies of the Labor opposition would cost a lot more in power and fuel costs.
Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister aware of the analysis contained in the Carbon Challenge by Dr. Jeff Bertram and Mr. Simon Terry of the Sustainability Council, published yesterday? In particular, its conclusions that his ETS is, quote, technically obsolete, end quote, and, quote, beyond rescue, end quote, as a sustainable framework for tackling climate change, and that it, quote, completely fails as a mechanism to make today's polluters meet today's emissions bill.
Speaker, can we take it that the flashing light on Mr. Chauvel is in fact a distress signal?
Order.
And do we need to get someone in here to help him?
Order. Order. Members of the House will know that it's to do with support for St John's, and one of the members' own colleagues was wearing one yesterday. Charles Chauvel, I invite him, order. I invite Charles Chauvel to ask his question again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order. I've called Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm delighted to support St John's. Is the Minister aware of the analysis contained in the Carbon Challenge by Dr. Jeff Bertram and Mr. Simon Terry of the Sustainability Council, published yesterday, in particular its conclusion that his ETS is technically obsolete and beyond rescue as a substantive framework for tackling climate change, and that it, quote, completely fails as a mechanism to make today's polluters meet today's emissions bill?
Honourable Dr.
Mr. Speaker, no I don't. We've carefully balanced the need for New Zealand to make progress on curbing emissions growth with a need for balance to ensure that the economy grows, as the Minister of Finance outlined with the latest GDP figures. It's a balanced policy approach, and I fear for both climate change policy and the economy with the switch that Labor has made and now favouring a carbon tax. Extraordinary flip-flop.
John Boscawen.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Climate Change. Does the Minister agree with the conclusions in Jeff Bartram and Simon Terry's book, The Carbon Challenge, that the New Zealand electricity industry will make some $566 million of windfall profits from New Zealand's ETS over the next 2.5 years? And if so, does he think supporters of New Zealand's ETS remotely understand the massive wealth transfer and the massive windfall profits to the New Zealand electricity industry?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
No, I don't. Effectively, Mr Terry and Dr Batram want the government to take a far more aggressive policy, a far tougher approach to climate change, and our government's policy is one that provides careful balance. That is that we make progress in curbing emissions, that we do our fair share on climate change, but that we also need to be cautious of imposing excessive costs on New Zealand businesses that would simply relocate offshore, do their emissions, cost New Zealanders jobs and do nothing for climate change.
Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Minister aware that the authors of the Carbon Challenge conclude that most of the future $5.7 billion bill arising from New Zealand exceeding its Kyoto Protocol target will fall on future taxpayers, making it, quote, a massive intergenerational transfer of liability, end quote, and that because forestry credits must be paid back when trees are harvested in 2020 or afterwards, using these credits to pay the Kyoto bill is like, quote, putting it on the plastic for the next generation to pay?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I would note that the government's policy around forestry and the emissions trading scheme is unchanged from the legislation that was put through the Parliament by David Parker. And what I find extraordinary is that that was Labor's policy only 18 months ago, and Charles Chauvel has now thrown that to the wall and said that his government's policy, Labor's view, is now a carbon tax. Where does Labor stand on this critical issue? Nobody knows now.
Question number 4, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.